Welcome to the SimSkies podcast, the podcast all about Flight Simulator. And now, introducing our host, who can fly a fake airplane with a little bit of confidence, Lexterio.
Hello, and welcome to SimSkies. This is episode number 1, Uno, the very first, in hopefully a long-running, future-going podcast. There are millions of podcasts out there, but not a whole lot with the flight sim community. So I decided, why not share my passion for Flight Simulator? And this has been in the works for quite a while. I haven't quite decided how I wanted to execute this podcast. As my YouTube channel has grown, I think I found a way that could make this beneficial to more people. And so this podcast will be for beginners, and hopefully will be for advanced users of Microsoft Flight Sim as well as X-Plane. Now, I will be straight up and honest with everyone right away. I am a Microsoft Flight Sim user. I was a X-Plane user for a few years, not as aggressive as I ever have been with Flight Sim in general. But I will be covering some X-Plane in there, of course, as well, within these podcast episodes. And thanks to the wonderful world of AI, it has helped me discover how to bring this podcast to life. So I used a couple different AI software out there to give me ideas of how I can execute this podcast best. And of course, using my own ideas as well, I've come up with a formula that seems to work pretty decently. So enough with the intro of the podcast. This is the first episode, so it's probably going to be a bit before I do the following episodes going forward, just to kind of gauge interest and see things that might need to be changed. Ideally, it will be a weekly podcast. I don't know exactly the days of release, but we'll kind of play that all by ears. So, of course, I need your comments down below of what you think of the podcast, things you'd like to hear within it, right? And things you want changed. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the very first episode here of the podcast. This first episode, I will be talking about getting started with Flight Simulator. It's a question that comes up a lot. If you've ever been in Discord, if you've been on Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, any social media platform, you have new people asking, how do I get started with Microsoft Flight Sim or with X-Plane or, just in Flight Sim in general? And thankfully, with the release of Asobo and Microsoft's Flight Sim in 2020, they were able to bring Flight Simulator to the console of Xbox. And it's allowed more people to enjoy this amazing simulator. Now, X-Plane is still only on PC and will probably only ever be on PC. I don't think they have any interest in ever bringing it to a console. And if they did, it'd probably be PlayStation to be competitive with Microsoft on the Xbox. But I don't think it's ever going to happen, honestly. So how do you get started? How do we get started in this beautiful simulator? Well, let's just go back in history just a little bit. The very first release of Microsoft's Flight Sim was in 1982. In 1982. So as I'm recording this episode, it's 41 years ago. Now, in 1977 is when the first development of Flight Sim started, and that was by Bruce Artwick. And he had a company called SubLogic, and he started developing this flight simulator way back then. And he was approached by Microsoft to bring this new simulator to IBM PCs, Apple II, and other PCs at the time. And in 1982, Artwix licensed his version of Flight Simulator to Microsoft, and it was marketed as Microsoft Flight Sim 1.0. So 41 years ago, 41 years of Microsoft Flight Sim, which is crazy to think. And there has been countless versions of Flight Simulator released. Now, there was a big gap. There was a really big gap between 2006 and 2020. So a 14-year gap between really a new version of Microsoft Flight Sim. Now, there was the Stream Edition in 2014, but it essentially was Microsoft Flight Sim X brought to the Steam platform. So I don't really count that as a new version of Flight Simulator. And there is a new version coming out this November called Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. How original. But that's kind of how it worked out. The one released in 2020 was actually supposed to be called just Flight Simulator. But as the fans tweaked and changed the name, it ended up being known as MSFS 2020 or MSSF or Flight Simulator 2020, right? So the fans kind of named it that, and that's just kind of what stuck going forward. So that's a little bit of the history of Microsoft Flight Sim, where it began. Now, as I said, Asobo has brought Flight Simulator to the Xbox. So the easiest way, if you do not have a PC or a high-end, mid-end PC, is to use an Xbox X or S, and that was released in 2021 on that platform. Can you fly Flight Sim with a controller, with a gamepad controller? Absolutely, you sure can, and lots of people do it. Is it ideal? Not so much. To get the full-fledged, real experience of a flight sim in general, X-Plane or Xbox, or Flight Sim, a joystick at least, at the minimum a joystick. And you can get some really, really affordable joysticks for the PC, of course, $20-$30, right? Now, some people do want to get the best experience possible, and with that, you do have to spend a little bit more money and get higher end quality products. That's not what I'm covering in this very first episode. This is just the beginning. How do you get started with this? And it's super simple. Figure out what you want to do. What's your ambitions? What's your goals, right? And so some people, they start off with this massive ambition. I'm going to become a real world pilot. That's great. This isn't really what the simulator is made for, though. It's a great tool to use, but it's not going to get you to become a real world pilot. It can get you some steps, but never going to get you to become a real world pilot. When it comes to the simulator, I feel the ideal target audience is people that have a major interest in aviation and people who would love to have become or want to become a pilot and just don't have the means to do so. So location or funding, because it is expensive to get your pilot license. It is super expensive and it's very time consuming. For not just to actually get in the aircraft and fly, but the studying behind it. And a lot of people have 40-hour work weeks to pay bills. So the simulator has become more of a I know a lot of people hate using this word, but a game to some people. And to the hardcore people, it's a simulator. They don't like using the word game because it simulates the real world environments, the real world aircrafts. And to them, it's more than a simulator. It's more than a game. It's a simulator. It's as close to you're going to get to actually flying in an aircraft at home. Okay, so we've talked about how to get started. In the beginning, an Xbox or at least a mid-specs PC. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about those specs because it ranges drastically. But if you look up on Google the minimum specs to run Microsoft Flight Sim, you'll see you get some pretty decent specs in there, right? Now, the argument of higher frame rates, less frame rates, that's, I think, on a personal level. But a medium specs, you can easily get 30 frames, and it seems to be that's a nice sweet spot for most people who are comfortable. And I think that's all you can get on the Xbox platform as of right now. Who knows what happens with Flight Sim 2024. But an Xbox, a PC, you know what? Ultimately, how do you begin? Figure out what you want to accomplish. If your goal is just to see the world in a simulator, that's a great goal to have. If your goal is to learn the basics of how to fly an aircraft, absolutely can do that within Microsoft Flight Sim. And within the simulator itself, it has training techniques of how to get you started. And they're well done. Well done. Now, besides just jumping in and flying in some of those tutorials, one of the biggest tips I can give you is YouTube. YouTube. You found this podcast. So clearly you've found ways of searching for aviation within YouTube, right? It's super simple. But YouTube streamers, content creators have all sorts of information that they can provide to you of how to get going in planes. And there's so many different content creators that will fly general aviation. And those are the planes with a nice little propeller on the front, typically like a Cessna 152, 172, call those the trainer aircrafts. There are many who fly those type of aircrafts, the very basic knowledge of learning how to fly an aircraft. And then there are streamers and content creators that fly commercial aircrafts. Those are the planes you get on as a passenger, and you're flying, across states. If you're flying from New York to LA, you're flying on a commercial aircraft. United Airlines, Delta, British Airways, etc. Those are the commercial. Those are the big birds. Those require a lot more knowledge because there's so many different systems in there. It's a lot of automation, but a lot of information you have to input to get that automation going. Think of it as if you bought a brand new TV, a lot of times you can't just turn on the TV and start watching YouTube, start watching Amazon Prime. You have to program the information in there. You have to download an app. You have to input your username and password. You have to select the stuff you want to watch. That is what I'm talking about in terms of procedures, but on a more complex level within Flight Simulator. So, can you just jump into Microsoft Flight Sim and start flying an aircraft? Absolutely. Will you be good at it? Probably not. Now, there are lots of training wheel techniques they can give you within both X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Sim. So I do suggest start off with the tutorials. I know a lot of it seems so basic, but it's super, super helpful. The next thing you want to do is do traffic patterns. And that is taking off from a runway and swinging around and landing on that same runway. Okay? And that's going to help you get familiar with that aircraft. That's going to help you get familiar with the speed and help you obviously get familiar on the landing and departures as well. Super important. You need to be able to take off, but you also really need to land that aircraft and do it nice and smooth. We're not looking for butter in every single landing. We're looking just for a nice, safe landing. So I hope that's enough to get you going, at least within the Flight Sim community, right? An Xbox, a PC, and then of course you need a copy of Microsoft Flight Simulator. On the PC, you need a copy of X-Plane. Now, the beginner planes I talked about a little bit ago, that would be the Cessna 152, which if you go to any typical training, real-world training environment, they're going to have a 152 for you to hop into, right? Or 172, but likely 152. That's going to be the first aircraft you should probably start flying in Microsoft Flight Sim or an X-Plane. And get to know the aircraft, because every aircraft is going to be a little bit different, but every aircraft flies the same way, right? So it's super, super important to understand the basics of how a plane flies. So when you get into a situation where things are a little hazy, right, You're flying, and there's a mountain nearby. You need to find a way to get up over those mountains because you can't go under those mountains. Well, you need to understand what the aerodynamics work on an aircraft. You need to understand stall levels, right? Just because you put in more power doesn't mean the aircraft's going to be able to go over those mountains. You need to know how far back you need to be to get over those mountains, or if you need to spiral around so you can climb and get over those mountains. Super, super important stuff. Very basic stuff, but things that people just kind of forget all about, right? Flight dynamics, how all the aircrafts fly. And again, they all handle a little bit differently based upon the power and the wings, the weather, time of day. All kinds of things have an impact of how these planes fly. So, tutorial, YouTube, super beneficial of getting started within Flight Simulator. From there, there are many, many add-ons you can get into. Many add-ons. But I personally recommend first, try the planes within the simulator. Understand those. When you feel you're really good at handling those default aircrafts, make your first purchase for an add-on. But do so on the less expensive side so you don't regret. You don't want to have buyer's remorse when you purchase your first aircraft within whatever simulator you are going to be flying into. And the other thing, be cautious when you buy scenery, because scenery within a sim is gorgeous, very gorgeous, handcrafted stuff. But only buy scenery if you know you're going to fly there enough, because some people will take a lot of money into sceneries and hardly ever fly at those airports. So it's your hard-earned money. Make sure you use it the best way you possibly can. So thanks for watching this very first episode of SimSkies. I do hope to do more of these in the future. Give me some comments down below what your thoughts are of the podcast, what you want to see in future podcasts, and hopefully well, I don't know. I can't hear you. You can't see me. But hopefully we'll at least, see your view within the next podcast. Take care as always.